Good day. Before I start this program, I just wanted to admit to an error in my previous program pointed out to me by a large number of people, a somewhat farcical one, and this relates to an interview given by Yevgeny Prigozhin, in which he spoke about a possible advance all the way to a place that I believe is La Mancha, which is, of course, a region of Spain. As a number of people have correctly pointed out to me, Prigozhin was, of course, referring to the English Channel, La Manche, as the French call it, and as it is widely called or referred to across Europe. Well, there we go. My mistake. My apologies. Thank you to everybody for pointing this out. What I would say, however, about that particular affair is that, yet again, it demonstrates the fact that Prigozhin was talking about the English Channel. What it demonstrates is that he was talking facetiously. I say that because exactly as I predicted in my follow-up, in my previous video, a whole lot of articles appeared, including headline articles in some sections of the British media, which assumed or pretended to assume that Prigozhin was talking seriously. Anyway, there it is. I'm not going to spend any more time over that particular affair, especially since Prigozhin has now announced a whole set of important battlefield news. And in fact, yesterday, he confirmed that the important village of Krasnaya Gora in north of Bakhmut has now indeed been captured by the Wagner organization. By the way, he also, in the same announcement, insisted that the only forces that are fighting in Bakhmut are Wagner organization forces. I'm not by any means confident he's right, by the way, about that, but I'm not going to get into the weeds of this. The fact remains that the Russians, the Wagner organization, have now captured Krasnaya Gora. I'll just read out the account, a report from the official Russian news agency TASS, which confirms this. Russian forces have seized control of the Krasnaya Gora village near Artyomovsk, which, as I always say, is actually the Russian name for Bakhmut, in the Donetsk People's Republic. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the founder of the Wagner private military company, said on Sunday. The Krasnaya Gora settlement has been taken by Wagner's assault units today, Prigozhin said, according to his Telegram channel. The channel also shows photos and video footage that confirm the capture of the settlement. And one of the most interesting facts about this capture of Krasnaya Gora is that even though there's been some suggestions from the Russians over the last couple of days that it has in fact been captured, which Prigozhin has now confirmed, though belatedly, we'll come to that in a moment, the actual first news I saw that Krasnaya Gora had indeed fallen under Russian control came from a Ukrainian channel. So this is one instance when one Ukrainian source was reporting the fall of Krasnaya Gora sooner than the Russians were. And I can't help but think that this is largely the effect of Prigozhin. He's insisted that from now on, the only person who's allowed to announce the particular capture of locations where his Wagner forces are engaged is himself. This has obviously come to be accepted. And the result is that sometimes information of the capture of a particular place comes slightly more slowly from the Russian side than it might once have done. And on this occasion, the Ukrainians actually preempted it. Anyway, I would just give a little detail about the fighting in Krasnaya Gora that I've seen from one Russian Telegram channel, which is Slavyangrad, I've mentioned them in the past. I consider them overall to be the most single reliable source for the day-to-day fighting in Ukraine that you can find in English. Anyway, Slavyangrad says that the Russians were fighting in Krasnaya Gora for several days, about 3 days, that there was the fighting going on inside the village, that there were attempts by the Russians to trap the Ukrainian troops in defending Krasnaya Gora in the village itself. At least that's my understanding of this report. But that in the event, some or most, or perhaps even all, of these Ukrainian troops who had been defending Krasnaya Gora were able to escape the encirclement and escaped to Paraskovievke, another village which is also being defended in this by the Ukrainians in this area. And this report also claimed that Krasnaya Gora, Paraskovievke, and a third village whose name I've forgotten, all constituted a new defense position on higher ground, that the Ukrainians cobbled together in a hurry following the fall of Soledar, and that they rushed troops to hold this particular part of the front line, this high ground. But it does look now as if Krasnaya Gora, with Krasnaya Gora being captured, this new defense line north of Bakhmut, northwest of Bakhmut, is cracking. And of course, the capture of Krasnaya Gora now conclusively means that the Russians are in control of the northern road entering Bakhmut, and it seems that they're also making further advances in the area, pushing south from the areas of Bakhmut that they have already occupied in the north of Bakhmut. At least that's my understanding of the overall situation. And there's also been more fighting and more Russian advances in other areas. I've discussed how the Russians seem to be at least very close to, perhaps on the outer boundary of Chasov Yar. It doesn't seem that they're there yet in big enough force to either storm or encircle Chasov Yar, but I presume that sooner or later that is also going to happen. Now, it's this same report that I was referencing went on to say that despite the fact that Krasnaya Gora has now been captured, despite the fact that the battle for the next village, Paraskovievke, which I've got an impression is actually a somewhat bigger village than Krasnaya Gora, but I might be wrong about that. But despite the fact that the battle for this village is underway, and despite the fact that the Russians now, as even the BBC, as even the British Ministry of Defence is admitting, now have fire control over all the main roads leading into Bakhmut, making it impossible to send large numbers of troops and supplies into Bakhmut along these roads. And notwithstanding all this, it's still premature to speak of Bakhmut as being fully encircled or turned into a cauldron, because there are still these smaller roads, these secondary roads, or perhaps even country lanes. I'm not sure whether this part of the world has country lanes, but anyway, secondary roads, if you prefer, leading into Bakhmut from the west across the fields and perhaps the woods to the west of Bakhmut, and Ukraine is still able to use those to send in troops into Bakhmut and presumably to pull troops out of Bakhmut, and can still use them to some extent at least to keep those troops in Bakhmut supplied. On the last, I will say this, I'm a bit more skeptical. I think that yes, you probably could get some supplies into Bakhmut along these country roads, but I can't imagine that you would be able to do it to the level needed to keep the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut adequately supplied with ammunition, which they're running through at phenomenal speeds in all of these battles, and of course with food, with fuel, which is bulky and obviously inflammable, and with other such things. So clearly there is some way still of getting into Bakhmut and out of it, but I don't get the sense that this is really a sustainable situation any longer. And it does seem as if the Ukrainians themselves might agree, because there was a report yesterday, which I saw, which I believe is official, from Ukraine, that from now on journalists are not permitted to visit Bakhmut. So the days when journalists could pop into Bakhmut and come out again, that's no longer allowed. And apparently, something like this also happened shortly before with Solidar, shortly before Solidar fell. So no more journalists allowed into Bakhmut. And there's also the usual rumour mill about General Zelensky, the overall commander of Ukraine's armed forces, demanding a plenary meeting with President Zelensky, which all the main officials are going to be joining, in which Zelensky is apparently going to plead once more for the total pullout of Ukrainian troops from Bakhmut, with General Zelensky apparently or allegedly or reportedly saying that the time window to pull these Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut out through these country roads is closing fast, and that before very long milder weather is going to set in, which will turn the ground softer, boggier again, more swampy, and that will make any retreat across the fields even more difficult, if possible at all, than it is now. So I don't know about where these reports about Zelensky and Zelensky having these meetings and having these arguments. There's been reports about this for many, many months now. There's never been any official confirmation of them. They sound plausible, but all I would say is, if they do indeed happen, then it's clear that Zelensky loses nearly all the arguments and just then carries on doing what Zelensky tells him to do. So that doesn't sound terribly impressive, but there we go. Now, regardless of that, we shouldn't lose sight of the main issue, which is that the siege, I think it's legitimate now to speak of a siege, the siege of Bakhmut it's got tighter, ever tighter. There is now even more of a crisis there for the Ukrainian troops that are still in Bakhmut than there has been. And, well, I've said in many programs now, stretching back over many weeks and even months, that I don't really understand the rationale of trying to cling on to Bakhmut in the way that it's being done. Why the lives of men are being sacrificed, I can't understand to what end and to what purpose, but there it is. It seems that for the moment at least, President Zelensky is determined to continue to do that. Perhaps if he's getting this advice from General Zelensky, that's going to make him change his mind this time. But to be honest, on past experience, I doubt it. Anyway, there we go. Bakhmut, resistance there crumbling. There's also been more reports of more Russian advances in other parts of the battlefields as well, that the Russians in particular have been making significant gains in the area of Krasnaya, Svatovo, that they're pushing forward in this area successfully. And, well, I'm not able to give a huge amount of information about this, But for what it's worth, here we have another commentary from Andrei Marochko, the former Lieutenant Colonel of the Lugansk militia, and he gave an interview to TASS earlier this morning, and he said units of the Russian armed forces are successfully advancing past Ukraine's defense lines near Krasnaya. With regard to the city of Krasnaya and its outskirts, I can confirm that our servicemen are maneuvering successfully. They have taken over a number of advantageous positions, driving out Ukrainian militants from their hideouts. Simply put, our offensive action has produced positive results. And TASS is careful to say that Marochko did not specify how far Russian forces had advanced, but he quotes him saying, it does not matter how far they progressed. What is really important are the positions that have been taken over, because the areas that have been taken over include commanding heights and advantageous positions, allowing control of wide swathes of territory. And Marochko is also quoted by TASS as saying that Russian forces near Krasnaya have enough manpower to fulfill their combat tasks. It looks like very tough fighting, very tough positional fighting near Krasnaya, which last I saw was between 5 and 7 kilometers behind the front lines, so it's very much a frontline town. But it does seem as if the Russians are pushing forward, that they're breaking through Ukrainian fortified positions, that they're capturing heights in this area, and they are pressing forward. And by the way, for the record, I think the same is probably true in Vuhledar, where the Ukrainians still insist that you Russians suffered very heavy losses. The British Ministry of Defence claims that the Russians lost more men yesterday than I believe in any other day of the war. I think that is extremely unlikely, by the way. It's entirely based, so far as I can see, from Ukrainian reports, which, well, they are what they are. But regardless, I do pass that on because, for what it's worth, that's what the British Ministry of Defence is saying. So that's where we are, it seems to me, on the battlefronts today. Not much news along most of the battlefronts, except for this very significant Russian advance near Bakhmut. As I said, the siege of Bakhmut continues. It tightens all the time. And to be frank, I strongly suspect that the time window for an organised withdrawal from Bakhmut has not only passed, I think I mentioned that some days ago, but I think that even a disorganised escape from Bakhmut along these country roads is now becoming exceptionally difficult, more difficult than it was during the Lysychansk fighting, and that I'm becoming increasingly sceptical about whether that can be carried out. I'm starting to think that the time for the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut has now essentially run out, and they will soon have to make themselves a difficult decision. Do they go on fighting to the very end, or do they arrange a capitulation of the town as their comrades who were trapped in the Azovstal factory eventually did, in disregard of orders from Kiev? Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the situation on the battlefronts today. There's been lots of reports of other sorts. There's been a very interesting interview with the Polish president, President Duda, who seems to also now be casting doubt on the prospects of Ukraine receiving fighter jets or military aircraft very soon. And I think that's plausible. I get the sense that altogether, after the enormous excitement, euphoria almost, that took place a couple of weeks ago during the time of the Ramstein meeting, when the German government, Chancellor Scholz, was maneuvered into agreeing to the supply of Leopard tanks to Ukraine. I think that since then, more doubts have perhaps started to grow, and perhaps there's been some suggestions amongst Western leaders that, maybe an overcommitment to this war is now becoming politically dangerous, and we need to step back and think again. I will say this: there's been one very interesting article in again, of all places, the Daily Telegraph. And what makes this article particularly interesting is that it is written by Jeremy Warner, who is, I believe, the Daily Telegraph's economics editor. So he's a fairly senior journalist in the Daily Telegraph, and I should say a very good one, in my opinion. I have often found myself in strong disagreement with the Daily Telegraph's political coverage on numerous topics, but I tend to find that their economics, their reporting and commentary on economics tends to be very good, or at least very interesting. And so Jerry Warner is both a senior journalist in the Daily Telegraph and, in my opinion, one of the more, shall we say, one of the higher caliber ones. And he's published an article in the Daily Telegraph which is very cynical about the war generally and about President Zelensky in particular. Now, I want to make it very clear that I don't believe that this article represents anything else than Jeremy Warner's own personal opinions. There are sometimes articles which appear, which I'm fairly sure reflect the opinions of a large number of people. In other words, that when a particular military officer, for example, retired military officer, writes a piece that's skeptical of the war, I sometimes think, and when it happens, I say, that this particular officer is probably expressing doubts and skepticism that are shared by many of his colleagues, and those colleagues have probably, to some extent, supported this article. Well, I don't think this article by Jeremy Warner is like that. I don't think that Jeremy Warner is in any way engaging in some kind of collaborative piece here. I think this is his own honest, sincere opinions. And since it's behind a paywall, I'm not going to read it all, but I am going to read parts of it. And the title is already suggestive enough. Zelensky plays his fawning Western suitors like a violin. And then the subtitle says, politicians are desperate for photo ops with Ukraine's president, even as their sanctions on Putin fail to deliver. And that's from the Daily Telegraph. And then we go on and we read in the body of the article, Zelensky plays his fawning suitors like a violin. Never mind warplanes. Fast-track entry into the European Union is now virtually assured. But first, he's got to win the war. Western aid or not, there is little sign of the required breakthrough or even a plausible answer to what winning really means. Is it taking back all the disputed territory, including Crimea? Without regime change in Russia, there is no chance of that. And the article then goes on to discuss sanctions. It takes its own take on sanctions. It takes the view that the reason the Russian economy has proved so resilient about sanctions is because the sanctions weren't really for real, that they haven't been of a sort that would have really put significant pressure on the Russian economy. And Jeremy Warner thinks that because it's also partly because that the sanctions weren't that severe, really, actually, that is the reason why the world economy, even the West European economies, have not been so hard hit by the sanctions. Well, it's a point of view, but I'm going to say actually that there is something to it. One of the most interesting developments over the last couple of days has been the way in which Western governments have, for example, picked away at their own oil price caps and oil embargoes that they've tried to impose on Russia. They're now basically saying, in fact, they are now saying, that provided Russian oil is mixed with oil from other sources in third countries, it can be freely imported into the European Union and will not be subject to price caps. At least that's what my understanding is. Well, what does that mean? Does it mean, for example, which is, I suspect, what it does mean, that if Russia exports oil to India and the Indians add a few drops into each barrel of Russian oil, of oil that they've sourced from, say, Saudi Arabia, so that it's 95% Russian but 5% Saudi, that it can then be exported to Europe at the global market price. Well, I suspect it probably does mean that. I haven't seen the exact terms, but one way or another, what this does show is that there's now clearly an attempt in the West to mitigate the effect of their own energy sanctions. They can do that with oil, by the way. It's more difficult to do it with gas. And gas, in my opinion, is the long-term time bomb under the European economy. But I'm not going to go into that in more detail. But he does say that Jeremy Warner does say things like this: astonishingly, the overall value of Russia's international trade, imports as well as exports, has been barely affected by the war. Any fall off in volume of its oil and gas exports has been more than offset by higher prices. Many Western goods have found backdoors into Russia via third-party countries such as Turkey and Armenia, which have seen their import-export business surge to cater Russia demand, and things of that kind. And he even says, even on oil and gas, where sanctions have been more effective, well, I've already suggested that might not be the case, Russia has found ways around the $60 a barrel cap that Western nations have attempted to apply to Russian oil. A thriving business has developed around unregistered or phantom ships that offload their cargo mid-ocean to seemingly more respectable carriers, no questions asked about origin. And he goes on into much of this. But anyway, let's not lose sight of his essential point. This is that Zelensky is playing Western leaders like a violin. He comes along, he talks to them, he gets everything he wants, essentially. Eventually he'll get his fighter jets. Eventually he'll get all his other weapons that he's demanding. But there is no clear idea of what the victory everybody is talking about over Russia, what that victory actually is, how to define victory. And Jeremy Warner basically says it makes absolutely no sense for Western powers to basically leave it to Zelensky to define Ukraine's victory for them, especially as Western powers are being pulled ever more deeply into the war, and that this is gradually undermining whatever independence of decision-making Western leaders still have. I think that is essentially a correct point, though I think it does underestimate the extent to which it has been in Washington rather than Kiev that the major decisions with respect to this war have been made and continue to be made. But one does get Jeremy Warner's point. Note that Jeremy Warner is saying this in the immediate aftermath of Zelensky's trip to London, when Zelensky addressed the British Parliament, and Zelensky's trip to Brussels. And we can see that there are some people, at least in London, who've kept a level head and who maintain or preserve their cynicism or skepticism about where all this is going, and who are not afraid to say so. One way or another, I think this is a commendable and brave article, and I hope that before long we will see more of them. And Jeremy Warner, perhaps because of his long employment at the Telegraph, has shall we say, is in a position to write articles like this, and I hope, frankly, that he expresses more of this kind of skepticism further still. Since we are talking about articles, I should say that a viewer has passed on to me a really quite extraordinary, quite exceptional article by Lee Slusher. Mr. Slusher, it turns out, is a person who has written many, who was a background in military affairs. He was apparently, his bio says that he's the CEO and founder of BT Consulting LLC. I'm not sure what that is, and that he's had a background in U.S. intelligence community and special operations, and that he's given advice to the U.S. Defense Department, embassies and embassy staffs, and to the U.S. Army Chief of Staff. And he's also developed and instructed intelligence training curriculums for the U.S. Armed Forces. And anyway, he is also fluent in Russian. Anyway, he seems to be a highly qualified person, and he's provided a very interesting article on the deep dive, which I'm going to provide a link to. But essentially, his point is that it's essentially much of what I've been saying on this program over many weeks and months, that basically what he's saying is that the Western powers have completely misunderstood the nature of this war. They don't seem to understand how the nature of the war at all. Many of them are living in delusional situations, and they seem to be unable to grasp how difficult the war is becoming for Ukraine, the enormous losses Ukraine is suffering over the course of this war, and the fact that Ukraine is definitely losing the war and will continue to lose the war. They will continue to suffer major losses. Mr. Slusher calls into question the whole narrative about the Russians not fighting the war well. By the way, he's echoed by the chief of the Polish military chief of staff, who's also given an interview in which he also says that the Russians are fighting well. And Mr. Slusher makes the point that the forces that the Russians are committing to the war are certain to overwhelm Ukraine, and that a Russian steamroller is gradually cranking up and will soon be heading across Ukraine westward. Might not be moving quickly. Steamrollers don't. They were still around in my childhood, and I remember seeing them. But anyway, that this steamroller will gradually be trundling westwards, and that there's nothing Ukraine can do to stop it, and nothing that the West can do to stop it. That Western militaries are so depleted in general, they've atrophied to such an extent since the end of the Cold War that they're not really in a position to engage the Russian military in the kind of way that they might once have been whilst the Cold War was underway. So it's a very interesting article, and again we see that some kind of debate does seem to be taking place in North America, in the United States, and this person, Mr. Sluisher, has come up with this article, and I wonder whether he's part of the debate. He does say that before very long, Western leaders need to make a decision which direction they want to take. Do they try to come to some kind of a settlement with the Russians over Ukraine on Russian terms, or do they escalate, in which case the only way in which they can escalate, the danger of escalation is that it will lead to World War III, with the Russians being able to match and indeed surpass every Western escalation as soon as it takes place. Now, if you want to say that you've heard much the same from Brian Paletic, from Scott Ritter, from Douglas McGregor, as Mr. Sluisher is saying, I agree, but it does seem important, or at least it seems important to me, that Mr. Sluisher is another one of these people who's setting it all out, and he does do it very effectively in one place, in a single article. And I do wonder again whether this article is also a part of the debate in Washington that is going on. Now, I do hope that there is such a debate in Washington. In fact, I'm convinced there is. I noticed that the Indian diplomat, M.S. Badrakumar, who writes this excellent blog, Indian Punchline, he also seems to think that some sort of a debate about how to end the war is underway in the United States also. But let us, of course, never overlook the problems. Now, over the last couple of days, we at the Duran, myself, my colleague Alex Christoforou, we've done a number of programs. We've run programs with people like Jeffrey Sachs, for example, discussing this explosive report by Seymour Hersh, describing or giving an account of the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines. To recapitulate, that report said that the decision to destroy the Nord Stream pipelines, that sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines, was carried out by the United States, that it was carried out with the assistance of Norway, that it was done in a way that was intended to bypass Congress in the United States itself, and most importantly, it was all decided by a tiny group of people right at the center of the US government. The president himself, his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, the Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, who, by the way, seems to me to be exercising an influence entirely out of proportion to her actual position in the US government. And I do find that worrying in itself, by the way. And that this group were assisted in doing what they did by the CIA, or at least by the director of the CIA, William Burns, and that he basically the CIA put together all the various component parts that enabled this operation to be carried out. Now, I've discussed this article in several programs now, I should say that I have received a private email from a friend of mine in Germany who's informed me that, in fact, there's been quite a lot of coverage of Seymour Hersh's article in Germany, some of it critical, some of it less so. Some of the political leaders have debated it and discussed it. Sarah Wagenacht of the Die Linke, who seems intent on setting up her own distinct party. She's made quite a big play on it, apparently. Anyway, it does look as if in Germany, this article by Seymour Hersh is, as it should be, a proper topic for discussion. As I said, people are entitled to take whatever view of it that they wish, but it doesn't look as if in Germany, at least, they're arguing about it, which is a much better situation than the one we have here in Britain, where it's been barely mentioned at all. But anyway, putting all that aside, the key point, the really worrying thing about the Seymour Hersh article is that it provided a light on the process of decision making at this very high level in Washington. Now, I want to, before I proceed, add again the important qualifier that, of course, you have to accept, if you're going to follow this analysis, that this article by Seymour Hersh is correct. I do. I've explained why I do. I would have thought that if it was false, there would have been a high-level denial from at least one of the participants, most plausibly the director of the CIA. That hasn't happened. The article, it seems to me, corresponds with all that we know about the process, about what happened to the Nord Stream pipelines. People have tweaked some of the details. I don't think anyone has challenged the essential story. And by the way, the fact that apparently only one source, there was only one main source, corroborated to some extent by another, I don't think that's in any way significant. Information provided by a good source. And who better to assess whether a source is good than Seymour Hersh, who's been doing this all his investigative reporter's life. Some reporting from a good source, a reliable source, is worth any amount of bilge provided by a dozen bad sources. Over the course of Russiagate, we saw lots of people coming forward and saying, that articles were appearing saying that they were all based on reports from 5, 6, 10, 12, multiple sources. And they turned out to be wrong. Many of them turned out to be fundamentally wrong. There's been a fine article published by, I believe, the Columbia School of Journalism or Columbia Journalism Review. You can find it, if you like, on the internet, which outlines this in great detail. The fact that Hersh has one source who looks like a good source, who's been able to provide a lot of detail, and that Hersh himself is comfortable with this source and has obtained corroboration from one other source, for me that's enough. As I said, given that there has been no substantive denial from any of the key individuals involved, especially from the director of the CIA. Anyway, put all this aside. Let's assume, as I do, that Seymour Hersh's article is correct. We have a tiny group of people making decisions. The President, the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, the Assistant Secretary of State. They don't apparently seek advice from a significantly larger pool. What they have are various people who, when this small group makes its decision, who they turn to and who are prepared, as the CIA director was in this case, to execute the president's instructions. But it doesn't look as if the CIA director himself played a key role in decision-making. And this small group of people all seem to have very similar perspectives on the war, on global situation generally, on foreign policy. In summary, all of them seem to be people, neocons. And one of them, Victoria Nuland, is, of course, married to Robert Kagan, who I would personally say is the chief ideologist or spokesman of the neocons. So this is a very small, very ideologically committed group of people. And they don't like getting advice that contradicts their ideological or political beliefs. That is very characteristic of groups of this kind. They tend to be very resistant to that kind of advice. I get the strong impression that they exclude from their company, or at least from access to their internal discussions, that sort of contradictory advice. In the run-up to the sanctions, for example, the big sanctions announcements that took place in February and March last year, they either ignored or froze out expert advice from people like the Federal Reserve Board, the financial community, the oil industry, and the rest. They just went ahead and imposed their sanctions anyway. And I can't help but think that they're almost certainly doing the same thing now with advice from other sources. So military advice, for example, that contradicts that which they want to hear, advice from people like General Milley, or General Miley, I'm not quite sure how his name is pronounced, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that Ukraine is going to lose, that it's time to negotiate a peace. That's probably unwelcome. And of course, you can get a procession of experts from the RAND Corporation, from the CSIS, from the International Monetary Fund, who have just said that the Russian economy is likely to grow this year. They can all come forward, but if the information they're giving is unwelcome, then I wonder whether this group will really want to listen to it. What they're more likely to do, to the extent that this information reaches them, this advice reaches them, which of course it does, is that they will do what people of this kind always do. They will look, they will clutch around, they will try and find nuggets of information that, on the contrary, they think they can spin in order to try to refute what the experts are saying. On the Duran the other day, we discussed the flurry of comments we've received, inquiries we've received after a Bloomberg report that in January Russia ran a budget deficit of $25 billion. And we explained, I think, that this is really, it doesn't have the significance that some people seem to think it does. But it's a classic sort of thing that I can just imagine. Well, I'm, fictionalizing now, but I can just imagine someone like Jake Sullivan, coming up with this, finding out this thing. He gets this economic information. He perhaps reads it, or somebody tells him about it. It's there on TASS. So he says, aha, Russia's running a deficit of $25 billion in January. So this proves that the sanctions are working after all. And then he phones up Lincoln and Nuland, and they all agree about it. And then the word goes round amongst the group. And of course, when it's a very small group, a lot of informal discussions probably take place. decision-making, discussion doesn't often happen in formal settings, as perhaps it should do when really important and big decisions are made. Anyway, they gleefully clutch onto this thing. It gets filtered through and published in Bloomberg. And the next time somebody comes along from, the Treasury Department, for example, or the Commerce Department, saying, well, things are not turning out on the sanctions front in the way that we expect, and they provide all the facts and figures and data and all that, well, you can easily imagine one of these people coming along and saying, oh, but look, in January, Russia ran a deficit of $25 billion. It's the sort of thing that small groups of this kind tend to do. So I'm afraid that so long as this group is there, intact, holding on to the levers of power, making the decisions, surrounding the president himself, who, to be very clear, it's now obvious, at least to me, from Seymour Hersh's article, shares their beliefs. So long as this group is making these decisions, well, I think they're going to be very, very resistant indeed to any talk of compromise or negotiations with the Russians. They will constantly instead be looking for some way out, some way that they can continue with their original plan, which, to be very clear, was regime change. President Biden effectively said as much when he made his speech in Warsaw back in March. Well, they're all going to be looking for some latest thing that they can do which will achieve the grand objective. And it's going to be very difficult to get this group to change its mind. I'd say personally it's going to be impossible to get this group to change its mind, or to get the president himself to part with them, unless there is a major military reverse in Ukraine, unless it looks as if Ukraine is on the brink of military defeat, in which case I think one of two things will happen. Either this group will want to radicalize even further, making even more extreme suggestions to turn the situation round. By the way, Slucha goes into great detail about the kind of reasoning, the kind of thinking that you will see from various different hardline factions when that happens. Some coming forward and saying, if Ukraine had been granted more tanks before, as I told you that should happen, well, we wouldn't be in this situation, so maybe we should do more of that now. There'll be that group. Others might agree that, yes, some kind of diplomatic compromise is in order, but this group, if they try to negotiate with the Russians, they will not do it with any real belief, and of course the Russians won't trust them. So those negotiations can only happen. That kind of change of view can only happen if there's a major breakdown in Ukraine, or alternatively if there's a breakdown in Washington. And since I get the sense that there's an accumulation of opposition or of skepticism in Washington about where this whole thing is going, that is not inconceivable. One of the most interesting facts about the Seymour Hersh article for me is that I noticed that Kamala Harris, the vice president, seemed to have been essentially excluded from all these discussions. I don't know whether that means that she disapproves or disagrees or what she feels. I know that she's not, well, perhaps the most popular of leaders or political figures in Washington at the present time, but it might be, I can see, a situation where if things really start to go wrong, if this group remains as unyielding as ever, the president eventually receives a delegation from the Democratic Party, from the security establishment, from the foreign policy establishment, who knows, who tell him that this has really got to stop. The time has come when he must change his foreign policy team, and that people like Sullivan, Nuland, Blinken no longer command confidence, and appoint a new team, this time perhaps with the vice president involved, or alternatively, if the president himself is not prepared to do that, well, he might want to consider his position. I mean, I'm speculating. I don't know how it's going to happen, but I would not be surprised if something like that would happen. But anyway, what the essential point I'm trying to make is that this piece by Hirsch tells us how incredibly difficult it's going to be to get the United States, or at least this administration, to change policy. Even if the entire uniformed military, most of the foreign policy class, Congress, and the financial people want a change of course, well, of course, they will eventually get it, but there will be a very hard battle in Washington before they do. Now, before I finish, I would say one further thing about Seymour Hersh's article. There's been a flurry of emails to me saying that undoubtedly Germany, or at least some people in Germany, were briefed in advance before this attack on the Nord Stream pipelines took place. I'm going to here give my own view. I don't personally think that Scholz himself, Olaf Scholz, was told about this attack before it happened. I know many people are referencing a specific section in this article where it says that Scholz wobbled whilst in Washington but was eventually brought into line, and they're reading into that an implication that Scholz was actually briefed by the administration that there was going to be an attack on the Nord Stream pipeline. I think that is reading more into Seymour Hersh's words than is there. I don't think that is what Seymour Hersh meant by that. I think if Scholz had been briefed by the administration whilst he was in Washington, I think that Hersh, if he knew that, would have said it simply, straightforwardly. But I do think it's highly likely that other people in Germany were briefed. And of course, I come back to what I was saying before. Given how bad relations between Scholz and Baerbock have now apparently are, if Scholz finds out that Baerbock knew all about this attack on Nord Stream before it took place and kept it from him, well, I think that would be such a major thing between them that I don't see how Baerbock could remain foreign minister. I think at that point, Scholz would have to sack her, even if that did create ructions within his coalition and put it in jeopardy. By the way, I'm not sure that Baerbock was briefed, though I would not be surprised at all. In fact, I think it is highly likely that others within the German government, or at least the German civil service and administrative cadre and intelligence community, probably were. But this is something which only reporting from Germany can find out, which is why it is a very good thing indeed that we now have apparently at least some public discussion of Seymour Hersh's report in Germany itself. Anyway, that's where I'm going to end this program today. Obviously, much more going on the Bakhmut front. It does seem to me as if, as I said, the siege of Bakhmut is indeed in its closing stages. We're definitely in the end game there. If it is indeed General Zelensky's advice to President Zelensky that the Ukrainian troops need to be pulled out of Bakhmut. Well, we will see whether President Zelensky listens and follows that advice. And whatever happens, I will endeavour to keep you both informed and at least to let you have my views. Thank you for joining me again today, and have a very good day. And as I said, more from me soon.